Welcome to Dividing the Waters and the Justice River exercise. In the next couple of hours, you'll hear testimony and information about the Justice River, a coastal basin with salmon and farming in the Justice River Valley, and who those farmers and irrigators take from both groundwater and surface water. You're going to hear from two experts, one a biologist, fishery biologist from the University of Montana. That's Dr. Jack Stanford. He's going to tell you a little bit about the salmon in the Justice River Basin. And then you'll hear from Dr. Thomas Harder from California, from the University of California at Davis, who's a hydrogeologist, a groundwater hydrogeologist, to tell you a little bit about how the system, the entire Justice River Valley and Basin system works. Let's get started. First up, Justice Ronald B. Roby will preside over the testimony and listen to the testimony from Dr. Stanford. Cross-examining Dr. Stanford will be Andy Sawyer from California from the State Water Resource Control Board. Let's get started. So with that, I'll let you, do you want to start with your
Okay, we will call the case of Justice River Tribes versus upstream water users. And as you know, we have two court-appointed experts. Our first court-appointed expert who is going to testify now is Dr. Jack Stanford. Dr. Stanford, could you give me a brief summary of your experience and qualifications relative to this case?
Sure. So my title is Bierman Professor of Ecology at the University of Montana. I'm director of the Flathead Lake Biological Station. In that capacity, I've been able to work on rivers all around the Pacific Rim, actually all around the world, but I focused on salmon rivers especially around the Pacific Rim in relation to long-term studies that I've done in the Flathead Basin in Montana.
Okie doke. Dr. Stanford, the court has previously agreed with the finding of both you and Dr. Harder that flows in the Justice River have declined over the past decades. Could you explain how those fish declines affect the fish at issue in this dispute?
Yes, I can. The way I'd like to do this, if it pleases the court, is to first describe the general biology of Pacific salmon and give some context from other rivers around the Pacific Rim in relation to the Justice River. If I can
That would be fine.
Are you do that, I'll use a few PowerPoints.
Okay, my assistant will help me with the PowerPoints.
So we'll go ahead and start them.
Give us a moment.
Must be, oops, which one is it?
Stanford.
So, let's see.
That's why I didn't do it.
Here we go. And lights. Perfect, thank you.
You may
Okay.
proceed, Doctor.
First point I want to make is that anadromous salmon, anadromous means that they are fishes that mature in the ocean and come back to fresh water to spawn, dump their eggs, and then the juveniles are reared for some period of time, sometimes up to 3 or 4 years in fresh water before they then smoltify or metamorphose into fishes that can then go back into the ocean. This is a complex life cycle, and in order to understand what the fish need in terms of fresh water, it's really important to understand a little bit about river ecology. Because remember, these are beasts that are part of a river system. Now, they have high fidelity for the rivers where they were born. They like to come back actually to the same gravel bars to spawn in the natal river. They will stray, however, and that stray rate is typically about 10% for a general rule of the thumb for all salmon around the Pacific Rim. Today we're talking about, in the Justice River, Chinook salmon, Colo salmon, and steelhead. Steelhead are shown in this picture over here. Those silver-colored ones are steelhead. They've been to the ocean. They're coming back to spawn. You can see how nice and fat those females are. They're full of about 2,000 or 3,000 eggs. These are resident males. They've never been to the ocean. they stay in fresh water because they're, in certain rivers, able to find enough food that they're not stimulated to go to the ocean. Steelhead typically occur in rivers that are sort of low on food, meaning that in order for them to be sustained in that river system, they've got to go to the ocean to mature, so they bring ocean nutrients back from the ocean to the river. And that's what you see here contrasted in these two rivers from Kamchatka and Russia. Why do I talk about Kamchatka? Because owing to the politics of the Kamchatka Peninsula being a strategic base for the Russians, for years, military base for the Russian submarines, nuclear submarines, for many, many years, the salmon were not harvested or otherwise influenced by just about anything in all of the Kamchatka Peninsula. And today, about 60% of all the wild salmon in the North Pacific Ocean come from Kamchatka. So I just want to give you some context of what a healthy, very healthy salmon river looks like and what the characteristics are of the salmon that live in them. So on this side, we have a river that's really simple. It doesn't have a lot of channels in it. It's a single thread from its headwaters down to the ocean. In this case, it's a tundra river. It's brown water. It warms up really fast in the spring in comparison to a mountain river or a clear water river, which you have on the left here. This river is called the Utoluk, and this one's called the Coal. And you can see our research camp there on the banks of the Coal River. Very different rivers. Simple one over here, simple geomorphically, and this one is much more complicated with a very, very expansive floodplain and a tremendous riparian forest. So this is the stark contrast that I want you to keep in mind as we talk about how these guys make a living in these two different environments. This river receives about 10 million salmon returning per year. And this river's not very much larger than our Justice River. This river is about exactly the same size as our Justice River, but again, it's not a complex geomorphology and its nutrient levels are very low because it doesn't have much of a return of salmon from the ocean. So the question that I want you to pose is, which river contains these fish and which river contains these resident fish? Well, the answer is that the anadromous fish are going to come back to the nutrient-poor river system because they're getting a good share of their nutrients from the ocean. These guys are common in this river, resident fish, because there's plenty of salmon for them to eat, salmon eggs. They're just like migrating pigs around the basin, eating salmon eggs and flesh, and so they don't need to go to the ocean. But all salmonids have extremely flexible life cycles. That's shown. These are the same fish, same species. It's just that this one has chosen a life history strategy that's different from this one. In rivers where the different life history strategies occur together, and that's virtually all rivers, they all spawn together, meaning that it's one big metapopulation or one big population of steelhead/rainbows. This is not commonly understood on this side of the Pacific because we never have seen rivers functioning in their natural state as we're able to look at in Kamchatka. So a little bit more on this that's really significant is that a steelhead mother can produce a resident offspring. A resident mother can produce a steelhead or anadromous offspring. This is that life history flexibility that I'm talking about. Finally, it's important to understand that rivers that get tremendous runs of salmon back to them annually, like we have in western Kamchatka, the whole ecosystem is much more productive than it would be without all these salmon returning. This is one of my students standing in the understory vegetation on the Coal River. In other words, he's standing out here in this forest. And this forest canopy is above him. You can see it up there. That's what you see here. These trees are these same. This is the understory vegetation under the canopy. It's growing from the ground level from tubers to 12 feet high annually. Why is that? because of the salmon nutrients coming back from the ocean that fertilize the whole ecosystem. And so we have a situation with productivity here is actually higher than an Iowa cornfield, just from the fertilization effect of the salmon coming back. So all rivers, all salmon rivers, all issues about salmon either are argued on the basis of stressors influencing an already poor producing system, or stressors that are affecting a fairly rich system. And one of the key characteristics here of these river systems is that flows vary from peak flows to base flow. Peak flows during floods or spring runoff, and base flows in the drier parts of the year. Or you could put it in terms of wet years and dry years. These fish, because of their flexible life histories, all salmonids, are really adapted they're really adapted to be sustained in these highly variable situations. So that's fundamental. And while I've described life history variation in steelhead rainbow, I could describe the same life history variation in Chinook or coho, because both Chinook and coho rear for a while in freshwater. It's just that their rearing in freshwater is typically shorter than steelhead and rainbows. So let's look then at the kinds of habitats that sustain these fishes. What is it they're looking for, and how much water do they need to do it? Now, when salmon spawn and the eggs hatch, what we get are little teeny fish, about this big. And they have to be able to stay in habitat that's beneficial to them, or they get washed downstream, right? So what kinds of, in a river system from the headwaters to the ocean, what kinds of environments are going to entrain those baby fish and hold them so that they can find adequate food and grow? Well, it's going to be areas like are seen here, which are expansive floodplain areas where the velocity of the river slows down as a consequence of the slope changing, just simply due to the geomorphology of that river system. This is a mountain floodplain, and very evident in this picture, you can see that there's a strong interaction between the rate of flooding, the movement of sediments, the ability of the river to knock the vegetation down, and the ability of the vegetation to grow back again. What you have essentially is a mosaic of channels out there in this graded or leveled floodplain, expansive floodplain area, in which there can be a lot of exchange between main channel environments and shallow, very productive off-channel environments.
What do you mean by a graded?
A graded means that our headwaters are starting as very steep rapids, pools, and then eventually the sediment that comes from the headwater areas has to be deposited in areas where the slope lessens or is less. That means a graded. And that's where we get these expansive floodplains, which is the situation in the Justice Valley of our river that we're going to talk in detail about. So these river floodplains that are extremely important rearing areas for nursery areas for salmon are expressed in these expansive floodplains where there's a great deal of interaction between water penetrating into the ground, flooding, and water returning from the alluvial aquifer to the river to sustain off-channel environments like this one here that are shallow and very productive. Now, in the Coal River, the previous example, it has tremendous numbers of off-channel environments that are not only nice shallow habitats for the nursery areas for the salmon, but it's also extremely productive because of the salmon nutrients are there. So one of the questions we always have to ask about rivers and salmon is, what's the return of adults? If the adult return is low, then probably they're not very productive rivers to start with. And that's in part determined by the number of graded or floodplain areas that occur in the river system from headwaters to the ocean. So let me give you an example of what goes on. This is a floodplain that I've studied for about 30 years, and
Well, I was going to say, we need to get moving along. We only have, we have a more limited time available.
Okay. I'm gonna move through this very quickly. My main message here is that floodplain reaches are fundamentally important as spawning areas and nursery areas for the salmon. In those two pictures there on the right, you can see the way in which flooding is creating a mosaic of channels, and those channels at low flow continue to flow from water that's stored in the aquifer system. So to speed it up, you can see the channel changes in this river system over long periods of time. It's a highly dynamic system. We refer to it as a shifting habitat mosaic. Some places stay constant, habitat stays constant over a long period of time, and some portions of it change very rapidly. Just to get on the ground to see some of these habitats, take a look at this picture on that floodplain, and you can see that depending on where the groundwater is coming out, the temperature will be warmer or colder, depending on the length of time that water that came from the upstream reach where it penetrated into the floodplain to where it comes out downstream further. In this case, this is a long flow path of cold water. There's a shorter flow path, and that's the river system itself at 15 degrees C. So you have this mosaic of habitat types out there that the fish are adapted to, and that's how they're able to apply that variable life history. This is a very good example of a spring brook on a floodplain like we have in the Justice Valley, and this is where 90% of the salmon productivity comes from these off-channel environments, not the main channel environments. And sometimes there are a lot of other species of organisms that are associated with these habitats, in addition to the salmon, that have requirements for warmer water. So there can be an array of habitats out there, and the fish will select which ones are best for them. There are a lot of other organisms also that use the fish. So we have to put the context of the salmon biology in the context of the basic attributes of the river system. And it's summed up in this cartoon here, which Dr. Harder probably elaborate on. We have this shifting habitat mosaic represented here, and the arrows just indicate whether it's flooding from side to side or whether there's a lot of penetration into the alluvial sediments, the sediments that are deposited by flows, and you have these floodplains distributed from headwaters all the way to the ocean in this idealized stream. And these are the places, particularly this one right here, where there's a great deal of lateral movement of water, exchange of water, and a great deal of vertical exchange of water, where you get this picture that sustains salmon and provides the best floodplain areas, or the best rearing areas for salmon. And this is exactly where our Justice River Valley fits in the scheme of things. Just want to present quickly some data. This is just a river in Alaska where we're classifying on this axis the complexity of the rivers. In other words, the ones over on this side have very many channels and complex habitat. These over here are more simple, and this is the run reconstruction of Chinook returning to the Kuskokwim River. Clearly, the complex rivers are the ones that are producing most of the salmon. This underscores my point that complexity in river systems matters greatly, along with the many other stressors that can come into play. In this case, I'm contrasting a river system, the Cole River in Kamchatka, with the Kwethluk River in Alaska. The difference between these two rivers is the Kwethluk has a lot of beavers in it, which restrict salmon movement to the lateral habitats. The Cole River has no beavers because the Russian Far East never had beavers ever. So again, the ecosystem context in relation to the salmon life history is critical in understanding how these little fish make a living and can then go to the ocean, come back as productive adults, and be sustained long term. The environment must be variable. If the environment is totally constant, the river system is totally constant, then they can express these different life history stages that are necessary in order to sustain productivity. Here we're just talking about the relationship between an undammed spring channel out on the floodplain versus one that's been dammed by beavers. It's pretty hard for a little fish to jump over that beaver dam.
So beavers are an impediment to the salmon.
Beavers can be an impediment to the salmon. We like to say, in some cases, beavers taketh away, in some cases, beavers returneth good things. They return good things in the context of retaining water in the headwaters so that the base flow remains elevated. So they do play a role that's positive, but they also play a negative role in preventing access.
You're saying it depends on where they are.
Depends on where they are, what part of the river system they're in. Yes, sir.
It's sort of hard to say beavers go up there and not down here, isn't it?
Beavers will go where they want to. And remember, though, in North America, we have, especially in south of the Canadian border, we've had many years of beaver reduction, and they're just now, after 150 years, beginning to come back. And so there's a lot of issues and discussion about where to put beavers, what part of the river system to put beavers in, to establish a better environment for anadromous fishes. I'm just telling you that that's one of the stressors that we're going to talk about.
Okay.
Just to illustrate the condition of rivers around the Pacific Rim in relation to our Justice River system, this is a study that we did some years ago where we took all of the major rivers around the Pacific Rim over to Kamchatka and ranked them in the context of complexity. In other words, geomorphic habitat complexity, realizing that those river systems with the most complexity are the ones that are going to be the most productive of salmon. And the rankings are there. It's no surprise that Bristol Bay in Alaska is one of the most productive areas, and a lot of our coastal streams down towards California are less productive. And then when we put that together in a map showing vulnerability of the river systems, the salmon rivers, to climate change and the existing human footprint, you come up with a story that won't be too surprising to you. The environments for salmon in the areas from the Columbia River down into California and further down are extremely vulnerability. Their vulnerability
So you're talking about the Justice River.
I'm talking about the Justice River. He'd be right in here. Most of our salmon are coming from the Pacific Rim, north of the Fraser River and from Kamchatka. So my point here is that the Justice River is a fairly sensitive environment for salmon to start with. And if you dewater it, it becomes even more sensitive to sustaining wild salmon. And I have to emphasize that we're talking here about wild salmon because around this Pacific Rim here, there are over 1,000 fish hatcheries dumping smolts that have never been adapted to a dynamic environment into an ocean environment. The return of wild fish, like we have in the Justice River, from a spawn is about 10%, 10 to 15%. So 10 to 15% of the eggs that are deposited typically return later as adults to spawn again. If you're going to have a sustainable fishery, you've got to have that kind of a spawner, quote, recruit relationship, or they can't be sustained. Now, what other stresses are going to affect them as they're trying to get back to their natal rivers? Well, the most important one is harvest on the high seas.
You mean fishing?
Fishing by commercials as well as sports fishers. Now, most of the rivers from California to well into Alaska have been chronically overharvested for 100 years. By chronically overharvested, I mean that fishers, human fishers, are taking as much as 80% of the returning fish annually. 80%. That's not sustainable, and that's one of the reasons why we see declining wild salmon populations around the Pacific Rim, but particularly California to Washington.
And that would include the Justice River.
That would include the Justice River. They are very heavily have been very heavily impacted by harvesting for at least 100 years. And only in the last 20 or 30 years have restrictions come on in those depleted rivers in the California-Oregon region. Only in the last 20 to 30 years have restrictions come on that harvest. So that's an important point to keep in mind. The other point is this vulnerability ranking includes anticipated climate change. We downscaled the climate for each river from the scenarios from the IPCC board that predicts climate effects out 100 years, and that intensifies the redness or the vulnerability of the rivers to the southern part of the salmon range. It also increases what used to be negative habitat or poor habitat in the north into more productive habitat. So if you're going to build your salmon fishing lodge, I wouldn't build it here, I'd build it up on the north slope.
So now, is climate change adversely affecting the Justice River, or?
Very adversely
Okay.
affecting the Justice River, as I'm showing here in the red, and as Dr. Harder will show in his calculations of the system. So, here we are to the Justice. Can I just present 3 slides to illustrate the points that I've just made about the salmon biology, specifically to our river in question? So, the Justice River is an interesting little river, about 800 square miles in size. The thing to note about it is that it only has one big expansive floodplain reach on it, and that's where all the controversy is, because this is also our irrigation reach. And the headwaters are not really great salmon habitat because they're high gradient.
You mean they come down real fast?
Yeah, go down really fast. It's whitewater. It's places where the little fish, when they come out of the reds, can't sustain. They get washed downstream. And if they're not retained in this graded floodplain area, this more level floodplain area, it's same place, it's good for hay rearing, it's also good for hay growing, it's also good for creating off-channel environments that the fish are retained in so that they can grow big enough to go to the ocean and then come back, and some portion of them harvested by our tribes.
So in terms of your interest in salmon, it's this green area that is the primary place where we need water, is that correct?
This is the critical reach for salmon. Notice that the river is going through mountain areas and is essentially a whitewater canyon all the way to the mouth of the ocean, where it can.
Except for this little valley.
Except for this little valley. So if we're going to have salmon in the Justice River, we've got to have an intact habitat relationship to flow, or amount of water available to them, in this green portion of the river, which is the Justice Valley. Now here's the essence of the salmon. These are the salmon in question, fall chinook, coho, and ocean-type steelhead. This is their spawning times. This is when they emigrate, meaning the little ones are moving down, getting ready to go out to the ocean to continue their life cycle. And this is when the adults come back. They enter the river, and then these are the boulder areas at the times that they spawn.
Spawning in the first part of the year, January,
Yeah.
February?
They'll spawn, the steelhead will spawn from January to March, even in December. Quite a variable life cycle. The 2 salmon species are much more specific in when they spawn than the steelhead. That's again because of that very life history.
And then they come back in the fall?
No, they will spawn. Let's go through the life cycle right quick for steelhead. They will spawn in the winter, and entering the river, let's start at the beginning. The adults coming back enter the river in August, September, October, right during the irrigation season. And then they spawn in the winter when flows are sometimes higher, and the little ones at the same time that are ready to go out migrate mostly during the spring runoff. Okay? Same for the coho to some extent. Notice the chinook, though, a very short entry period in the fall with spawning, and then a little bit longer emergence and out-migration period for chinook. Okay, where's the irrigation season? It's right in here. This is when the river's being dewatered.
You mean the time when it reduces the water most in the river?
Yeah.
You're talking about August through October?
August through October. This is a critical time because the adult fish are trying to get back up the river. And if the river is depleted down to very minimum flows, they can't ascend those rapids that are down in the lower canyon between the Justice Valley and the ocean itself. So low flows affect the salmon in two ways. It affects their ability to get back to their spawning grounds, and it affects the ability of the juveniles to grow because the shallow water habitats that they depend on are dry. Let me show you that.
So if they're really dry, I guess they'll die. Is that
They'll
right?
die.
Okay.
Exactly. They're going to die. So here's the reconstructed hydrograph for the Justice River. This I understood to be at the mouth of the river, though, not in the Justice Valley. But in any case, you can see that the flows, the dotted line, the historical flows, meaning recorded flows in the last 50 years or so, are the solid line, and the most recent modern flows are this dotted line, and the climate-based estimate is the more bold line. So it's going to get, in some cases, a little wetter than it's been under the climate scenario, but in any case, from about mid-August into October, that river is at basically no flow.
That's the critical time for salmon.
In this critical time for the salmon, both coming in and growing, the river is so low that the shallow water habitats are dry. That's why the fishes in this system have, in part, that's why the fishes in this system in question have declined so dramatically. And they're at about 1/10 of what they historically were, or less.
So are they in danger of becoming extinct?
They are in danger, very great danger of becoming extinct. In fact, I would predict they will be extinct unless this low flow problem is augmented. So how much water do they need? If the historic flows that dry the river up are between, and this just happens to be in cubic meters per second, and I've just put some key numbers in here in cubic feet per second. If the river is dry in the areas that are optimum habitat for growth of salmon, then we're going to have to raise that base flow enough, if the objective is to sustain salmon, that they can survive. And that means getting up in the range, up in a much higher range, somewhat similar to the historic peaks that we've seen occasionally in the very meager recorded history of this river system. Now, I set in my report the minimum flow at 500 cubic feet per second. You can see on this curve that's way above probable availability of water. But from my studies and modeling of floodplain dynamics, it's going to take about that much water to rejuvenate and cause these off-channel environments that are important rearing areas to be sufficiently watered that the food web can develop there and support the baby salmon.
So now how much of the year do you have to have 500 CFS, because this is only a portion of the year?
This is just the basic, I would say, this just in this basic period here of historic minimum flows. So it's the fall, early winter period that's critical here. And I argued that the max that you would shoot for is 500 CFS. If you did that, if you managed to get that back in this river system, you would sustain the salmon. If your minimum flow, though, turns out to be somewhere between 30 and 70, which it is today, the salmon productivity is hopeless. There's just no place for them to rear. So is there a middle ground there? Probably, but that depends on other stressors. When you have really low water and hot summer temperatures, late summer temperatures, temperature can be a problem. Salmon and steelhead quit growing when the temperature exceeds about 17 degrees centigrade, or about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So more water typically means cooler temperatures. Also, we've got to keep the habitat that they need sustained by peak flooding. So the spring runoff is extremely important in restructuring that floodplain environment so that those flood channels function as spring channels at low flow. If that's
So you
not,
still need these flushing flows.
got to have the flushing flows or the habitat fills up with vegetation, just like I showed you in my earlier slides. And then finally, the returning fish have to be, the returning spawners that are successful in the ocean have to be treated charitably. They can't be over-harvested, or you can never get above a threshold in which these fish can bounce back. Now, in the Justice River, as I understand it, there's no harvest allowed at all at this point in time because the fish runs are so low. That doesn't mean they're not being harvested out in the ocean, though, by commercial fishers, because commercial fishing occurs from California all the way to Alaska. And the problem with that pressure from commercial fishing is accelerated by the presence of about 5 to 7 billion hatchery smolts that are growing out there in the ocean too. And even though those hatchery smolts are only returning about 1/10% in terms of the spawner-recruit relationship because they're poorly adapted to living in the wild, they're still elevating the number of fish out there that can be caught. And rivers like the Justice River that are under stress from very low numbers are impacted disproportionately to rivers that are producing more fish because the fishing pressure is this high on them and there's only a few of them, so proportionately more of them get caught.
And there are no hatcheries on the Justice
There
River.
are no hatcheries on the Justice River. So we have a river system that theoretically, and in terms of ecology, is in pretty good shape. There's no dams on it. It has a good rearing area for salmon, and it has a native salmon culture there, native people salmon culture. So it's a good candidate for restoration. But the fish have got to have base flow water from somewhere. And we've examined a number of scenarios for getting that water. Could be recharging the aquifer, because the aquifer is a primary source for maintaining those off-channel habitats during the critical rearing and spawning periods. We could build dams in the headwaters and retain some of the spring runoff, maybe a lot of it, and then discharge that downstream during the irrigation season to augment what's being taken by pumping the aquifer or diverting surface flow. That, though, is offset by the need for flushing flows to maintain the habitats.
So you're saying that if you store it for another reason, then you're also limiting it as flushing flows.
That's right.
Okay.
Now, you get around that a little bit if you use beavers in your headwaters for storage, because they're not going to build huge dams, but they'll build complexes of dams in the headwaters and bleed that water out slowly. So beavers might be an option. In terms of actually turning this river system on again and maintaining all the irrigation, it's a difficult scenario.
But your bottom line, Doctor, is that you have to have 500 CFS during these critical months.
That would be your precautionary principle. That would be the volume of water that you'd like to have in that river system at the mouth of it to sustain those shallow water habitats in the Justice Valley. Now, 70 CFS down to the lowest measured, which I think is 10, is simply impossible for salmon to survive. So there's a potential compromise somewhere between 70 and 500, depending on whether it's a wet year or a dry year.
You don't have a recommendation, or do you have a recommendation?
My recommendation is to shoot for 500 and then negotiate from there, and then also really carefully quantify the relationship between water volume and the sustained productivity of shallow water salmon habitat in the Justice Valley.
Which would mean additional studies?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because that relationship between flow and the inundation, maintenance of inundation of the critical salmon habitats is not precisely determined.
Okay. Doctor, thank you very much. I think we will now ask Mr. Sawyer to cross-examine you on behalf of the irrigators and the tribes, all of those who divert water from the surface and underground streams in the surface and underground in the Justice River Valley. Mr. Sawyer?
Thank you, Your Honor, and for the record, I am Andy Sawyer of counsel with the firm of Calvin and Hobbs, representing the Justice Valley Growers for Truth and Justice. We appreciate receiving your written report, and many of my questions will be based on that report. On page 2 of your report, you indicate that before 1900, there were several thousand Chinook, 20,000 coho, and 3,000 to 5,000 steelhead in the Justice River Basin. Are your recommendations intended to restore fish populations to those pre-1900 levels?
No, my recommendations are based on sustaining enough salmon spawners that the populations can be maintained. Otherwise, they're going to go extinct.
And what would be the target number of fish to achieve those recommendations?
Well, it would be best if the historical numbers were approached. However, you have the interaction between habitat in freshwater and success in the ocean, growing success in the ocean, coupled with harvest. So you're probably never going to get to the historical levels, but at least you could get to some level that would allow a reasonable number of fish to be returning annually so that they could be used by the tribes in cultural purposes, as well as produce enough offspring that you could be sure that a run of some decent size would be coming back from that cohort of spawn.
What would that reasonable number be?
I don't have it exactly, but let's split it in half. Let's say half of the coho, half of the Chinook, and half of the steelhead. Right now, we've got steelhead and Chinook very close to extinction. Coho a little bit better. Mainly because coho are less dependent on the floodplain reaches for spawning, not for rearing, but for spawning, than the other two species.
Is that number attainable with the other
It
changes
would be
we've
if
had?
you reactivated the base flows.
Your written report indicates that you reviewed Dr. Harder's report. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Dr. Harder's report estimates that 2/3 of the reduction in summer flow is due to climate change. Are your recommendations for stream flow intended to address the 1/3 of the problem that my clients are attributed to, or to require them to make up for the effects of climate change?
If you want salmon back in this river system in any numbers, it's a combination of both.
So just for clarification, you're asking for my clients to restore flows by more than they're depleting the flows in order to make up for the effect of climate change?
That's correct, and that goes back to the slide that I showed where the Justice River area is under extreme climate stress.
So simply ceasing diversion altogether would not be sufficient for my client's contribution. Is that what you're
Probably
saying?
not.
Again, getting back to Dr. Harder's report, he indicates that there has been a substantial change in irrigation practices in the late 1960s and early 1970s with a reduction in summer stream flow. Are you familiar with that?
Yes?
In your opinion, were the flows before that change adequate to protect the fishery?
Probably not, because this fishery began to decline dramatically before those changes, those water conservation procedures or techniques were put in place.
But there have also been other stressors, including
Absolutely.
overfishing, that changed over that.
You have fishing pressure, climate warming, and increasing irrigation, all impacting at once, and it's difficult to allocate fish bodies to stressor.
So the effect of your recommendation could be, again, that my clients are being called upon to make up for the effect of other stressors, including ocean harvest.
And your answer is yes. The
The answer
witness's
is
answer is
yes,
yes.
yes, but a caveat. Those other stressors are controllable. If the more controllable probably than the irrigators making up water, because you can stop harvest or harvest selectively if the right statutes are in place. The climate dynamics in the ocean appear to be less stressful than the climate dynamics in freshwater. So again, the target focused on this base flow is the critical variable.
Getting back to Dr. Harder's report, his report on the physical conditions of the watershed indicate substantial variability in the water available from season to season, year to year, and even within a given season. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a funny little river in that regard.
And the native fish are adapted to that variability.
They're adapted to it, and let me just say that for rivers like the Justice River, short coastal-oriented rivers coming from snowmelt systems, we typically see a base flow that's about 2 orders of magnitude less than the peak flows. This is typical of those types of rivers in that region. So in that way, the Justice River is in fact similar to other rivers in the region. I don't want to get that misunderstood.
And don't the fish depend on that variability in some respects? For example, taking a pulse and flow as a cue for migration?
Depend on it is probably the wrong word. What they're able to do is adapt to it because they have that in their genes. They have evolved in Pacific coastal environments that have changed dramatically since the Ice Age to today. So they are better critters at dealing with environmental variation than most because of their unique life history plasticity and their high fecundity. So of all the organisms we could pick to study in this river system, they should be the most able to deal with environmental variation. And yet what we see is their numbers crumbling down to virtual extinction.
I'd like to direct your attention to figure 2 of your report, which I believe was also the second to the last slide, depicting the life cycle of the salmonids in the Justice River. Flow and temperature needs vary depending on which phase of the life cycle the fish are in. Is that correct?
Is your question that the fish require different temperatures at different times of the year?
Different temperatures, different flows at different times, different stages of their life cycle. Is that correct?
That's too much of a generalization. The adult fish that are coming back require a temperature range, yes, and that temperature range is generally related to flow. If the flows are very low, the temperatures are too high. So the fish are stressed to start with, and they can't get up the river because the falls are too extreme. Higher flows they could. And the temperature would typically be lower at higher flows. For the juveniles, their temperature restrictions are pretty strict. They grow best at 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Their growth rates decrease as you increase temperature above that level. Now, the Justice River has a long, probably geologic history of relatively high temperatures. So these juveniles are probably more adapted to living at high temperatures than in most mountain river systems. I would expect that to be the case if we did studies on them, stress studies. So yes, they have, different life stages have greater or lesser flexibility in their response to temperature. The adults probably less so than the juveniles, because the adults are trying to get through that main channel up to the spawning grounds, and they will only spawn at a certain range of temperatures. But remember, if the floodplain habitats are intact, remember I showed temperature variation in relation to the flow path of the groundwater? They can move around if those habitats are interconnected. So if it gets too warm in one, they'll just swim around to one that's closer to their optimum. And that's a key feature of these floodplain environments that's related to the volume of the aquifer.
Well, as an example, there may need to be a certain flow for the migrating adults to make it upstream over falls or cascades.
Yes?
But those flows would only be necessary when they are in fact migrating
Yes.
for that purpose. So
Yes.
there's variability depending on whether they're migrating or in other life stages as to whether those migration flows would be necessary. Is that correct?
The witness, you said yes.
Yes, I said yes.
And similarly, the temperature needs of incubating eggs may be different from those of juveniles. Is that correct?
Yes.
And therefore, wouldn't it be correct that the flow standard should not be uniform, but that should instead set different required flows for different times of the year based on the part of the salmonid life cycle that's at stake?
Yes, I agree with that. Remember, these beasts are adapted to variation, but they also are aquatic. So if the habitat is dry, they're toast.
I noticed that scientific term in your report.
Or raisins.
I think
Sometimes they
that-
look like raisins.
I think it's nice that scientists can use ordinary people's words, Doctor.
But your recommendation does not have variation, does it? It's 500 cubic feet per second.
For the base, not for the peaks. In other words,
I think Mr. Sawyer, he's recommending going above 500.
I'm
Thank you for the
recommending
clarification.
that higher base flows occur in these critical times right here, which happen to be critical times for irrigation too. In the spring, we've got to have some flushing flows or the habitat's not sustained.
You observed that the historic winter flows were between 500 and 1,000 cubic feet per second in your report. What were the historic summer and late summer flows?
Well, it's hard to reconstruct that, but they sometimes were very low, apparently, as low as 150, 50 CFS, 100 CFS. There were dry years in this Justice River based on the Harder report. So there was a fair amount of variability in the river system. But that's why salmon and steelhead are so fecund, so produce so many eggs, produce so many offspring, so that they can endure those lower flow levels. But when you get to dry minimum flows month after, or year after year after year as a consequence of irrigation, their flexibility is defeated by just the sustained dryness where they can't grow and reproduce properly. So yes, they can get through a bad year, but they need good years routinely as well as the occasional bad year.
Inviting your attention again to Dr. Harder's report. On page 6, he estimates spring flows of several hundred to 1,000 cubic feet per second. And for dry periods after the snow is melted, 10 cubic feet to 60 cubic feet per second. Is that correct?
No, not quite. The peak flows were in the vicinity of about 20 to 30,000 CFS. And the base flows varied from a few hundred, 500, down to essentially a dry river, about 10 or 15, which is why I started my testimony by emphasizing that this is a sensitive river system for salmon to start with.
But you do concede that in dry years, the base flow was 10 to 60 cubic feet
The
per second.
occasional dry year, yes, I do.
And yet your report recommends a base flow of 500 cubic feet per second.
if those floodplain habitats are going to be productive. Whether you have to absolutely have that high of flow every year is probably a point of contention that has to be elaborated more by a very quantitative understanding of the relationship by flow at the mouth of the river and inundation of these off-channel environments by aquifer outflow.
How do you expect to achieve a base flow of 500 cubic feet per second when the natural flows in summer sometimes ranged in the 10 to 60 cubic feet per second range?
I didn't intend that it be sustained 500 every year. That's a target for sustaining or enhancing the salmon productivity of the river system.
How can the decree be enforced if you have a target but you don't have to meet the target?
That's not my job. I was asked what the salmon need.
Dr. Harder's report indicates that crops consume about 95,000 acre-feet per annum, while forests, woodlands, and grasslands consume 685,000 acre-feet per annum. Wouldn't it make more sense to thin the forests, cut the grass, than to cut back crops to achieve those higher flows?
You have to ask the salmon that question.
Seriously, should we be crafting a remedy that deals with the biggest
In
water?
this river system, in this river system, it would behoove the participants to craft as many alternatives as they can, because there's clearly a water shortage. Whether or not that one's a good one or not, I don't know.
On page 5 of your report, you discuss the issue of, I'll call it icing, maybe there's a better technical term. Icing where the river freezes not just on the surface, but all the way to the base, killing the salmon. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's one of your concerns, is to have adequate flows to prevent that icing.
Especially aquifer outflow, because the aquifer tends to take on the average air temperature. So in very, very cold midwinter periods, when the river is likely to freeze to the bottom, many of these off-channel environments don't even have ice on them because of the winter warm conditions of the aquifer outflow.
On page 6 of your report, you point out that climate change is reducing spring flows. That reduction in spring flows is because less precipitation is falling as rain, as snow, and more as rain, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
And we also have warmer temperatures in the winter than we had without climate change.
Yes.
So whatever else climate change is doing, shouldn't climate change obviate the problem of icing by having more winter flow and warmer temperatures in the winter?
That depends on the variability of the climate effects in the short term. We know that these river systems on the coastal area are very much influenced by El Nino and Pacific Decadal Oscillation and other conditions in the ocean that are on a much more short time frame than the overall gradual influence of global climate variation. So my point is that icing is still going to be a problem in the near term, and the near term is where these fish are either going to make it or they're going to go extinct.
But doesn't the increase in winter flows and warmer temperature create opportunities to actually capture water in the winter that might otherwise be needed for flows? But since the flows are higher, some of that water could be captured.
Higher winter flows are going to keep the aquifer system fuller or fatter,
Recharged?
bigger, recharged better. And so, yes, I agree with you.
And wouldn't that present the option for some of my clients to actually, if you will, irrigate in the winter to recharge in order to reduce the impacts in the summer?
That's certainly an option if it fits with proper kinds of crops.
I want to talk a little bit about other stressors, such as the lack of fencing.
Lack of fencing?
Fencing. What are the impacts of that and what can be done about it?
All right. we're talking about livestock grazing effects interfering with the groundwater surface water exchange in shallow water environments. This is typically a habitat problem in all floodplain areas of river systems because cattle really like to stand in the stream. And so fencing the cattle out of critical environments, spring channels and so on, like the one I showed was fenced specifically to keep the cattle out, is good management.
And if we took that step, how much could we reduce your minimum base flow recommendation?
I don't think that fencing the critical habitat has any relationship to is not linked to the relationship between aquifer outflow and river volume.
What if we took steps to increase riparian vegetation to provide shade by the shore of the river?
That will help in two ways. One, it reduces the temperatures, and two, it provides another alternative forage source for the small fish of insects falling out of the canopy of the trees, yeah. But the trade-off is that more riparian vegetation transpires more water from the aquifer. It's another trade-off.
And how much would you reduce your base flow recommendation if we provided for better riparian vegetation?
I can't quantify that with the information I have.
You mentioned in your oral presentation the need for nutrients, and that the rainbow trout can stay resident with sufficient nutrients, whereas they need to migrate to the ocean and steal it if they don't have sufficient nutrients. Would it help if my clients used more fertilizer?
Cow crap and fertilizer are not equal to salmon bodies in any way. This is an issue that's in fisheries management big right now. And the studies that are most credible show that the breakdown of salmon bodies is very, very different than using more fertilizer or actually fertilizing the stream or allowing the stream to be polluted by cattle or whatever. So let's not make let's not take home the conclusion that you can substitute fertilizer or cow crap or whatever salmon bodies. Totally different ecosystem processes. Lots of things eat salmon bodies, but very few of them eat potassium nitrate.
Could we tailor the fertilizer use to better protect the fishery?
That depends on what the concentrations of nutrients are from the polluted area or from the irrigated areas. The Justice Valley is really not very big, and so the likelihood that the agricultural practices are adding enough nutrients to the river system to make it more productive for salmon is low.
Could we help restore the fishery through channel modifications, channel restoration projects?
It's always best to let the river do the work.
Yet your recommendations include no specific recommendations for channel maintenance or flushing flows. Is that correct?
Yes, they do. I said in my report that it's absolutely essential to maintain some peak flows near the historic maxes that were occurring at least some of the time, some years, in order to keep those off-channel environments in a geomorphic and ecological form that the fish can use. If you chop off or lop off the peak flows, those environments will clog up with vegetation and sediments and not be useful to the salmon.
So that's a flushing process.
That's
is that
the
right?
flushing process. I tried to emphasize through all of my testimony that you must have a peak flow, and you must have a peak flow that will flush the habitats and a base flow that will maintain the groundwater surface water interaction between the off-channel environments and the aquifer.
With climate change, we can expect warmer and perhaps heavier winter storms, correct?
That's what we predicted from our studies, yes.
So that will take care of the necessary peak flows, unless we fail to put bypass requirements in new reservoirs. Is that correct?
Peak flows sustain off-channel environment, whether they come in August or December, whether they come in June or December. However, if we have salmon eggs in redds that have been deposited and are incubating, and we get a scouring flow, that can cause mortality to the eggs and further problems. So this relationship between the timing of peak flows and climate change is an uncertainty.
Your Honor, I have one more question unless my co-counsel passes me additional questions.
All right, Mr. Sawyer.
So to summarize, your testimony is asking for a base flow of 500 cubic feet per second, even though that exceeds the natural summer base flow in most summers, and even though most of the reductions are caused by climate change. Is that correct?
That's correct in the context that I estimated that the period when the salmon were very abundant in the Justice River system was during a period when the base flows were approaching that number, 500.
And my co-counsel just spoke up and passed me the following question. What would be the required frequency for having peak flows, if not required on an annual basis?
Yeah. We always will trade, in terms of flushing flows, we'll always trade peak for duration. In other words, give the river a chance to do a fair amount of work moving materials around, as opposed to just coming through in a couple-day period at a higher flow. But we typically talk about environmental flows being constructed around a wet year and a dry year scenario, in which the wet years provide the peaks, and the dry years really carefully determine the minimum base flow that will be allowed.
So as I understand it, Doctor, there are no dams on the stream, so what comes down in the peak flows is whatever rains and what snow melt, right?
We're going to have to live with it, yeah.
So there's no way to control that in the present time, is that correct?
It's going to be up to the fish to adapt to that changed regime, but my argument is that they have the evolved ability to do that better than most organisms because of their long evolutionary history since glaciation.
Is that all the questions you have?
I have no further questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sawyer, for cross-examination, and thank you very much, Dr. Stanford, for your report and your testimony today, and the court will be in recess.